You're a funny guy, Sally. I like you. That's why I'm going to kill you last.
Remember, Sally, when I promised to kill you last?
That's right, Major. You did.
I lied.
Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about Commando. So a few months back, I did a video called 10 Underrated Action Movies, and in that video specifically, I kind of highlight my love and affinity for the action genre, and I specifically talk about like my love for different types of action. Like there's the more serious, grounded, gritty action. There's the more over-the-top, kind of campy and silly action. Like there's various degrees of action movies, and the action movie I'm going to be talking about today is one of the best examples of that. This is a personal favorite of mine, a childhood favorite, and one that I never really get sick of. It's a film that I would call the perfect 80s action movie. It's not the best 80s action movie. If you were to ask me what's the greatest action movie, I'd probably say Die Hard. I mean, I think most people would say Die Hard. That's probably the greatest action movie of the 1980s. But whenever I think about specific 80s action movie tropes, and specific elements and visual motifs that we see in 80s action movies. What is the 80s action movie that kind of encapsulates all of that into one movie, that has all the cliches, all the corny one-liners, all the bombastic, over-the-top action? I would say Commando feels like if you put like every 80s movie into a blender, more or less, Commando's kind of the result you would get. And that's what I think is kind of fascinating about the movie. 80s action movies in general, I mean, I think the reason that decade in particular is so beloved amongst fans of the genre is because that's the decade where action movies kind of became solidified. Like if you look at previous decades, whether it's like from the 1950s, where it's like, what's the action movies of the 1950s? You could argue like Western films were kind of the action movies of the 1950s. If you go even the decade before the 80s, like what were the action movies of the 1970s? I'd say probably a lot of crime vigilante movies, films like Dirty Harry, The French Connection, Death Wish, and then of course there was the whole martial arts kung fu movies of the 1970s that was starting to get popular in America thanks to films like Enter the Dragon. But in the 1980s, they just took all of those elements from previous decades and they made them even bigger, even more bombastic, even more over the top, even more kind of cartoony or like comic book in style. Like the gritty realism of like those early action movies are kind of gone by the time the 80s comes around. It would get even more just crazy. And of course, a lot of it, because of the time these films were made, pretty much all of the visuals were done practically. All real stunts, real explosions. And, you know, there's a lot of action movies in modern days that are using a lot of CGI and all that stuff. And that does kind of take away from, like, the visceral factor that a lot of 80s action movies have. The realism that we like. Realism in terms of the filmmaking, not in terms of, like, you know, actually accurately representing violence in the real world. Like I said, it's completely over the top. But to me, Commando, that's the one 80s action movie that just, like, it's got everything you would want in an 80s action movie. So let's get into it. Basically, the film revolves around Arnold Schwarzenegger's character, John Matrix, who is a retired special forces soldier / spy. I mean, the movie doesn't really get too much into specifics. He's retired now, and he's living a very secluded and peaceful life with his daughter. But then, like this movie, right out the gate, we're seeing people get shot and killed, and we find out later that these men that are being murdered were directly related to John Matrix because they were part of his Special Forces team. And then, literally after being informed this by his old sergeant, like within 30 seconds of him talking to him, the bad guys come and try to capture Matrix and his daughter. We then find out that some old vengeful colleagues are going to be blackmailing John Matrix into doing a political assassination somewhere in South America, I believe. But he's essentially blackmailed to go carry out this political assassination. Otherwise, his daughter will be killed. And so he's going to be put on a plane. And he has, I think, around like 11 hours, 12, 11 hours before he has to get off the plane and rescue his daughter before the guys find out that he never went to the country. And so there's kind of a running clock in the movie that really drives the pacing and energy. And yeah, I mean, that's the plot of the movie. It's a classic 80s action plot where the plot is in service for the action and the action alone, and that is what you want. This movie's not really worried about character development. It's not worried about exploring any meaningful themes. This is not that kind of movie. This is the kind of movie that's like, we're going to give you your money's worth. We're going to give you so much action that it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, what I love about this movie is that, first of all, it's a tight 90 minutes. And not a single minute is wasted. Like I said, this movie, right off the gate, I think less than a minute into the movie, we see a guy getting killed while he's trying to take out his trash. With Uzis from these two gentlemen on the back of a dump truck. One of them is Bill Duke, who is a filmmaker himself. He made the movie Deep Cover with Lawrence Fishburne, and he was also, of course, in Predator. And there's a great action moment between him and Schwarzenegger.
You scared, motherfucker? Well, you should be, because this Green Beret's gonna kick your big ass.
I ate green berets for breakfast.
And right now, I'm very hungry.
There's not a single minute wasted in this movie. Every action sequence in the film also gets bigger and more insane as the film goes on. So like the movie is consistently filled with action. There's so many scenes. And then by the time we get to the last act, it's like the filmmakers are like, okay, now we're going to really bring out the big guns, both literally and metaphorically. We're gonna really crank this up. And it gets even crazier. And there's really no disappointing action scene. There's no scene that feels lazy or kind of like uninspired. Like it's all so much fun. It's all so violent. One of the most violent scenes is kind of towards the end where Schwarzenegger's in a shed and it almost turns into like a Friday the 13th movie for a second. He cuts off the dude's arms and he scalps him with a saw blade, one of the other guys. Like I said, it's kind of everything an 80s action movie should be. Yeah, I remember hearing a story, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but it sounds like it's probably true, where the director of Commando, Mark L. Lester, this movie came out the same year as Rambo 2. It actually feels very similar to Rambo 2 in some ways, but there is a significant difference, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I believe Rambo 2 came out first, and during post-production, Mark L. Lester saw the film, and he decided to do some reshoots to make sure that Schwarzenegger kills more guys than Stallone did at the end of his movie. So he was watching Rambo 2, he's like, okay, we're going to make a Commando even more insane to outdo Rambo 2. And that is hilarious to me. Rambo 2 is also like one of the most perfect 80s action movies. I love kind of the Rambo series as a whole. 1 through 4, that fifth one doesn't count. I'm a big fan of Rambo, and I would love to do an in-depth review of all those movies because I have a lot of opinions on them. And so there's a lot of similarities between Rambo 2 and Commando, just in terms of the way the action is filmed. But the significant difference between the two, and this is one of the reasons I love Commando as a whole, is that you can tell that Commando is clearly winking at its audience, where Rambo 2 is taking itself very seriously. Commando is the type of movie that it knows what it is. It's self-aware. You can tell by the sheer amount of one-liners in this movie, by the way, all of which are amazing.
Right? Wrong. Do me a favor. Don't disturb my friend. He's dead tired.
What'd you do with Sully?
I let him go.
Fuck you, asshole.
Fuck you, asshole.
Come sta?
Come on, Bennett. Let's party.
Seriously, there's not a weak one-liner in this entire film. There's even a moment where Schwarzenegger gets meta. He looks at Bennett and he says,
I'll be back, Bennett.
you can't tell me that this movie isn't aware. Like, it's not, like, come on. It's pretty obvious that Commando's winking at its audience. The entire movie has lots of little moments of humor in it. It's a movie that doesn't take itself too seriously, but it takes it seriously enough to the point where the action sequences are exciting, and the action itself isn't a joke. Like, the action is legitimately well directed, very well executed, and a ton of fun, but the movie knows that it's kind of silly, and it embraces that in a way that not many 80s action movies do. And it does it perfectly. It finds that balance perfectly. Like, at no point does the movie ever feel like it's wanting to become a complete joke of itself. But like I said, there are little moments that are really well executed. But Commando is a great movie for Schwarzenegger because you get to see that side of Arnold where he's really charismatic and he's clearly having a good time. And even though he's very limited with his acting abilities, he more than makes up for it with that charisma, with that sense of humor, with his physical performance, obviously, because he's absolutely massive in pretty much all of his action movies from the 80s and going into the 90s. And you get to see that side of Arnold where it would really kind of define the rest of his action movie career. I think it really starts with Commando in terms of him being a leading action man with that charisma, with that likability, with that kind of tongue-in-cheek, winking at the audience charm. I think it really starts with Commando. And it's a movie that I end up watching like maybe once a year without even thinking about it because I love really good cheesy action movies, and whenever I'm in the mood for specifically a cheesy action movie, specifically an action movie that is not taking itself that seriously, but the action is awesome, Commando is the first one that really pops into my head. It's got a sense of humor. It's 90 minutes. It's a movie that feels even less than that. It feels like almost like an 80-minute movie because it moves. There's no slow points. There's no point where the movie is like, oh yeah, we're trying to slow down and let the story breathe. Like, no. This movie's not about the story. It's about Arnold Schwarzenegger shooting bad guys, beating them up, swinging in a mall, hanging out with Ray Don Chong, and then him getting the best of Bennett, played by Vernon Wells, who was, of course, in Road Warrior and a bunch of other movies, with that amazing final line right before he kills him.
Let off some steam, Bennett.
Like I said, this movie, whenever you think of a cliched 80s action movie, Commando is the one it checks all the boxes. It's got everything. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Commando. Tell me what you guys think of this movie. Do you love it? Do you hate it? What are some of your favorite 80s action movies? What are some of your favorite kind of cheesy, over-the-top action movies? Please list them in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching.